structure of the original text. Have you noticed that certain corners of your home seem to absorb joy, while the plants you so carefully tend wither without explanation? Saint Carlo Acutis discovered something extraordinary that was never widely shared. Certain plants we consider harmless might be portals for dark energies in our homes. Write, "I want to purify my home," in the comments today if you're ready to discover the truths that Saint Carlo Acutis shared only with his closest friends about these plants that might be stealing peace from your family. Saint Carlo Acutis never sought to be an expert in spiritual botany. He was a young man completely dedicated to serving others through his computer skills and deep faith in Milan, Italy. Known for his unwavering devotion and his commitment to helping others through technology, Saint Carlo spent his days creating websites about Eucharistic miracles and inspiring others. But God had plans to reveal truths that would help not only the faithful in Italy, but families throughout the world. I never imagined that the Blessed Virgin would speak to me about something as ordinary as the plants in our homes, Carlo confessed to his friend Andrew in 2005. I thought those things only mattered to gardeners, not to a simple servant of Christ like me. Saint Carlo used to say that daily prayer is the key that opens God's heart. That's why we've prepared a daily prayer guide for the entire month, inspired by his words and example of faith. Find it now in the first pinned comment and start each day with a prayer that will bring peace, strength, and light to your life and family. It all began during a particularly difficult night at the pediatric cancer ward where Carlo regularly volunteered. It was March 2005, a few months before his health would begin to decline. A young boy named Michael had been brought in with a critical condition. The doctors couldn't explain his extreme weakness beyond the obvious malnutrition. I was exhausted, very exhausted, Carlo writes in his private journal. I knelt beside Michael's bed out of habit, praying my rosary almost without thinking. I had been praying it the same way for years, but that night was different. While praying mechanically, he felt an extraordinary presence. It wasn't a chill or a visible apparition. It was an inner certainty, a peace that became absolute clarity. It was then that he heard, not with his physical ears but deep in his heart, a voice he recognized as Mary's. "My son, many care for their gardens but neglect their souls. Many decorate their homes but unknowingly invite in what destroys. I will show you what few have seen, the plants that seem innocent but carry shadows." Andrew, who was present that early morning when Carlo left Michael's room, remembers, "When I saw him, his face was different. His eyes, always tired from long days at the computer, shone with a light I hadn't seen before. He didn't say anything for hours, just wrote in his small notebook with trembling hands." Carlo understood that he had received knowledge about something affecting millions of homes without anyone suspecting. These weren't superstitions or popular folklore. They were profound spiritual truths about how certain plants, by their nature and origin, could become entry points for dark influences in Christian homes. What surprised me, Carlo continued explaining to his closest friends, wasn't just receiving this revelation. It was verifying its truth in the homes we visited. I started observing. In every house where we found these specific plants, there was a pattern. Divided families, unexplained illnesses, an atmosphere of spiritual heaviness that didn't match the prayers being said there. Sarah Johnson, a 76-year-old woman from the Midwest, was one of the first to experience the power of these revelations when they finally reached America through Carlo's websites. For 15 years, she had suffered from terrible insomnia and nightmares that left her exhausted every morning. Her home, although clean and tidy, had an atmosphere that her own children described as heavy. "I tried medications, alternative therapies, even had priests bless my house," Sarah recounts. One day, a young man who knew about Carlo Acutis' work came to visit me. He entered my living room and stopped in front of a plant I had kept for years. He looked at me with serious eyes and said, "Mom, do you know what you have in your home?" The young man explained that this specific plant, which Sarah had received as a gift and cared for diligently, was one of the 3 that Carlo Acutis had identified as carriers of negative influences. Sarah was skeptical at first. How could a simple plant cause so much harm? "I found it hard to believe," Sarah admits, but the young man insisted. He explained that it wasn't about the plant itself, but about what it represents spiritually and the energies it attracts. I finally agreed to remove it from my house, although it pained me because I had become attached to it. The first night after removing the plant, Sarah slept restlessly as if something was missing. The second night, she had a disturbing dream, but didn't wake with the usual panic. The third night, something extraordinary happened. I dreamed of a young boy, dressed in casual clothes with sneakers. Although I had never seen Carlo Acutis in person, I instinctively knew it was him. He didn't speak, but his presence communicated peace. When I woke up, the oppression I had felt in my chest for years had completely disappeared. Since that week, Sarah sleeps deeply. The nightmares that tormented her for 15 years vanished. But most surprising was that her relationship with her children, who had distanced themselves without apparent reason, also improved. What nobody had told me, reflects Sarah, is that these plants don't just affect our rest or personal peace, they affect relationships, health, even faith. It's as if they created an invisible veil separating families from God's grace. Carlo explained to his friends that these revelations weren't meant to sow fear or superstition. This isn't about black magic or witchcraft, he clarified firmly. It's about spiritual discernment. Just as there are blessed objects that attract grace, there are elements in nature that, for different reasons, can become obstacles to that grace. During the years 2004-2006, while Carlo traveled across Italy creating websites and documenting Eucharistic miracles, he discreetly shared these teachings with specific people. He didn't do it publicly because he feared it would be misinterpreted or become sensationalized. This is sacred knowledge, he said, not to satisfy curiosity, but to protect families who sincerely seek to live in God's presence. Can you imagine your life without that inexplicable heaviness you sometimes feel when entering certain rooms in your home? Those corners where the light seems dimmer, although there's no physical reason for it? What you're about to discover might explain mysteries you've experienced for years without understanding them. If you feel this revelation is for you, write "Protect my home, Mother Mary" in the comments right now. Your public declaration of faith is the first step toward purifying your sacred space. What Carlo discovered that night was just the beginning. Soon the revelations would deepen, showing him specific details about these plants, their origins, and why they have the spiritual effect they have. And most surprising, how to identify them before they cause harm in our homes. Many wonder why these revelations at that time. Carlo had a clear answer. We are in times where the enemy works with greater subtlety. He no longer only attacks openly with obvious temptations, he infiltrates the everyday, what seems harmless, what we decorate our homes with. John Miller, 73, from the Northeast, had spent his whole life cultivating plants with passion. His home was practically a garden, with dozens of species he cared for with religious dedication. But despite his love for plants and his sincere Christian faith, his family suffered from constant, inexplicable conflicts. We were a family that prayed together, that went to church every Sunday, John recounts. But at home there was a tension no one could explain. My children constantly fought. My wife and I argued over any little thing. It was as if something was pushing us to hurt each other. When in 2010 a young priest who had studied Carlo Acutis' life visited John's home to bless it, he immediately stopped in front of a specific plant that John had kept in his main living room for years. The priest didn't say anything immediately, John remembers. He just observed it for several minutes, then looked around the house, and finally asked permission to speak privately with me and my wife. What the priest revealed changed their understanding of their own home. He explained that this plant, though beautiful and apparently innocent, was one of the three that Carlo Acutis had identified as spiritually problematic. The priest shared the knowledge Carlo had received and how other families had experienced transformations after removing these plants from their spaces. John and his wife were skeptical but desperate. They agreed to remove the plant, although it pained them because they had cared for it for almost a decade. I removed it that same afternoon, says John. I gave it to an acquaintance who wasn't a believer, explaining only that we needed to make space for other things. The changes began subtly. In the following days, John noticed that family arguments decreased. His children, who normally insulted each other several times a day, began treating each other with more patience. His wife commented that she felt lighter, less irritable. 2 weeks later, continues John, my oldest daughter, who hadn't been to church in months, asked us to take her to service. We were so surprised we hardly knew what to say. When we asked what had happened, she herself couldn't explain it. She just said that she felt something had changed in the house, that she breathed differently. Carlo explained that these plants act as spiritual antennas. They don't have their own will, nor are they evil in themselves, he clarified. They are part of God's creation, but due to their particular characteristics, their history in pagan cultures, or their use in dark rituals throughout the centuries, they have acquired a negative spiritual resonance. It's like an object that has absorbed bad prayers for generations. This understanding didn't come from superstition, but from years of practical observation. Carlo and his friends had visited thousands of homes in Italy and other European countries, and in those homes, a pattern repeated with astonishing frequency. Where there were certain specific plants, there were also specific patterns of suffering. It's not coincidence, Carlo insisted. It's a spiritual reality that we must recognize with humility. Just as a crucifix brings blessing, just as holy water purifies, there are objects and living beings that can bring influences we don't want. Do you remember any moment when you entered your home and felt something wasn't right, although everything seemed in order? That sensation of discomfort without apparent cause, that heaviness you can't explain with words. Carlo discovered that often the cause was literally growing in a pot, being watered with love, without anyone suspecting its true spiritual nature. If you already feel that this teaching is touching something deep in your heart, write, "I need to know about these plants," in the comments right now. Linda Smith, 69, from the West Coast, had decorated her home with plants throughout her adult life. It was her passion and pride. Neighbors admired her beautiful indoor garden and the lush plants she had in every room. But Linda hid a secret. For years, she had suffered from severe depression that no medication seemed to completely alleviate. "I felt trapped in a constant fog," Linda describes. "Doctors prescribed stronger and stronger pills, but the sadness wouldn't go away. The worst part is that I had no reason to be depressed. My family was fine. We had no serious financial problems, but I simply couldn't feel joy." In 2013, when Linda was 57, a cousin of hers who had studied Carlo Acutis' life brought her a letter written by one of the young men who had personally known Carlo. In that letter, the revelations about specific plants that could affect mood and peace in the home were briefly mentioned. "At first it seemed absurd to me," Linda admits. "How could my beautiful plants be responsible for my depression?" But my cousin insisted. She told me to at least try to remove certain plants for a month and see if there was any change. Linda finally accepted, more to please her cousin than out of conviction. She identified 2 of the plants mentioned in the letter in her home. One was in her bedroom next to her bed, where she had kept it for almost 15 years. The other was in the main living room, a gift she had received from a neighbor who had passed away years ago. "It hurt to remove them," she confesses. "I felt like I was betraying my plants. It sounds ridiculous now that I say it. But I took them out of the house and left them in the backyard, away from the windows." The first week, Linda noticed no significant change. The second week, she started sleeping a little better. But it was in the third week when she experienced something she hadn't felt in years. "I woke up one morning, and the first thing I noticed was that my first thought wasn't negative," she relates with an emotional voice. "For years, every morning I would wake up with a weight on my chest and dark thoughts. That morning, I simply opened my eyes and thought about breakfast. Something so simple but so extraordinary for me." In the following days, Linda noticed that the fog in her mind was gradually dissipating. Colors seemed brighter. Food tasted better. She started laughing with her grandchildren, something she hadn't genuinely done in a long time. "My husband was the first to comment on it," she remembers. "He told me, 'Linda, I don't know what happened, but you're different. It's like you've come back.' And he was right. I had come back from a dark place where I had been trapped without knowing it. 3 months after removing the plants, Linda visited her psychiatrist for her regular appointment. The doctor was amazed by her improvement. He asked me what new treatment I had started, says Linda. When I told him about the plants, he remained silent for a moment. He didn't believe it, of course, but he couldn't deny that something had radically changed. Carlo taught that the first type of problematic plant is directly related to discouragement and depression. This plant, he explained to his friends, has been used in ancient cultures in rituals of mourning and despair. Although today it's sold as common decoration, it maintains a dark spiritual memory. In Christian homes, it acts like a sponge that absorbs joy. Linda eventually learned the specific name of this first plant when she had the opportunity to speak directly with one of Carlo's friends who visited the United States. The friend confirmed that indeed, this was the main plant that Carlo had identified as causing depressive states and spiritual discouragement. Not all people are affected in the same way, the friend explained to Linda. Some are more spiritually sensitive, but in general, where this plant remains for years, joy slowly withers, as if the plant fed on it. The first plant that Carlo identified is commonly known as the pothos, or devil's ivy. This popular name should already alert us to its spiritual nature. Although it's one of the most popular indoor plants in the world, due to its easy care and ability to survive in difficult conditions, Carlo discovered that this resistance comes with a spiritual price. They called it devil's ivy long before I was born, Carlo explained to his friends. Popular names often contain forgotten truths. Our ancestors knew things that modernity has dismissed. The pothos has heart-shaped leaves that grow on long vines. It's practically indestructible, can live in water or soil with little or much light, and reproduces with extreme ease. This unnatural vitality was one of the signs that alerted Carlo. In God's nature, he reflected, everything has balance. Plants that give much require much, but this plant gives without asking almost anything in return physically. What is it taking then? It's taking from another dimension. Robert Wilson, 71, from the southeast, had his house full of pothos plants. He had placed them in every room, hanging from shelves and climbing up walls. I liked them because they required almost no care, he explains. With my work and responsibilities, I didn't have time for delicate plants. The pothos was perfect, always green, always growing. But Robert noticed something strange over the years. Despite his Christian faith and maintaining a life of constant prayer, he felt his prayers had no power. It was like shouting in a room with padded walls, he describes. The words came out of my mouth but didn't seem to go anywhere. In 2011, Robert attended a spiritual retreat where one of the speakers who knew about Carlo's work gave a talk on purifying the home. He briefly mentioned, almost in passing, the warning about the pothos. Robert felt a blow to his conscience. I returned home that night and looked at my house with new eyes, he remembers. There were pothos plants everywhere, vines climbing the walls as if they wanted to cover everything. Suddenly I realized they seemed more like an invasion than decoration. Robert made a radical decision. That same week, he removed every pothos plant from his home. They totaled more than 20 plants. My children thought I had gone crazy, he laughs now. My wife was between confused and concerned, but I felt an urgency I couldn't explain. The effects were almost immediate. The first time I prayed after removing the plants, Robert relates with an emotional voice, I felt something different. I don't know how to explain it. It was as if my prayers finally had weight, as if they reached their destination. I cried with relief without fully understanding why. Carlo explained that the pothos has a dark history in many Eastern cultures. In Italy, where I spent most of my life, he recounted, the elders knew that this plant should not be cultivated near places of prayer. They said it ate prayers, intercepted them before they could rise. This ability to interfere with prayer is perhaps the most dangerous effect of the pothos in a Christian home. Carlo observed that in houses where this plant abounded, families gradually stopped praying together. Not by conscious decision, but by a kind of spiritual apathy that slowly settled in. It's subtle, he warned. It's not that you suddenly stop believing in God. It's that you slowly lose the desire to talk to Him. Prayer becomes heavy, boring, meaningless, and without realizing it, weeks have gone by without you having truly prayed. Patricia Brown, 67, from the Midwest, experienced exactly this phenomenon. For 20 years she had been a Sunday school teacher in her church, but had gradually lost her fervor. I kept going to church out of obligation, she admits. I kept teaching Sunday school because I was already committed, but my heart was cold. I felt nothing. When she finally heard about Carlo Acutis' revelations about the pothos, Patricia remembered that she had started cultivating these plants exactly when her spiritual dryness began. I had never connected them, she says, amazed. But when I thought about it, The correlation was perfect. The more the plants grew, the more my spirit withered. Patricia removed all the pothos plants from her home one Saturday afternoon. The following Sunday at church, she relates, I experienced something I hadn't felt in 2 decades. During communion, I felt a real presence. Tears began to run down my face uncontrollably. It was like waking up from a long, confusing dream. Carlo emphasized that the pothos doesn't affect all people in the same way. Some are more spiritually resistant, he explained, but for those who are sensitive, this plant can create a spiritual desert in the home. And the most dangerous thing is that the process is so gradual that we don't realize it. We believe we're simply going through a phase of spiritual lukewarmness, when in reality we're being affected by something in our physical environment. If you have pothos plants in your home and have noticed a decrease in your spiritual fervor, a growing difficulty in praying, or a sensation that your prayers aren't heard, Carlo would advise removing them immediately. Don't give them to other Christians, he warned. Either destroy them or place them outside inhabited spaces, far from where you pray or sleep. James Thompson followed this advice to the letter. After removing his pothos plants, he burned them in his backyard. I know it sounds dramatic, he says, but while burning them I felt I was doing something necessary, almost like an exorcism of my home. That night, James had a vivid dream. I saw my house as a fortress with sealed windows and doors. Then a brilliant light arrived, pushing from outside, trying to enter. Finally, all the windows burst open and the light flooded every room. I woke up with a peace I hadn't known in years. Carlo also specifically warned about placing pothos in rooms where children sleep. Little ones are especially vulnerable, he explained with maternal concern. Their spirits are more sensitive. I've seen children with constant nightmares, inexplicable fears, and when we removed these plants from their rooms, the night terrors disappeared. Lucy Martinez, 70, from the Northwest, confirms this observation with her own experience. Her 5-year-old granddaughter, who lived with her, suffered from terrible night terrors. She would wake up screaming 2 or 3 times a night, Lucy recounts. She said she saw shadows in her room. The doctors said it was normal, that it would pass with time. But it didn't pass. For 2 years, the little girl suffered these constant nightmares. Lucy had placed a large pothos in the child's room, thinking it would purify the air and make the space more cheerful. When she finally heard Carlo's warnings about this plant, Lucy removed it immediately. The first night without the plant, Lucy relates with tears in her eyes, my granddaughter slept completely peacefully. There were no screams, no fears. The next morning she told me something that chilled my blood. Grandma, the bad shadow left with the plant. I had never told her anything about the plant. She simply knew. If you have pothos plants in your home, especially near where you pray or where your children sleep, seriously consider Carlo's words. This saintly young man, who dedicated his life to God's service and never sought sensationalism or attention, felt the urgency to warn about this specific danger. His warning should not be taken lightly. Write, I will protect my home from this plant, in the comments if you're determined to act on this revelation. Your public declaration will strengthen your determination. But Carlo didn't just reveal one problematic plant. As he deepened in prayer and observation, he identified 2 other species that also bring negative influences to Christian homes. The second plant he discovered has even more disturbing effects than the pothos, especially in family relationships. During his years volunteering in Milan, Carlo regularly visited families in need. In these visits, he noticed a disturbing pattern. In certain homes, despite the family's sincere faith, there were constant and inexplicable conflicts. Fights over trivial reasons, misunderstandings that escalated to shouting, resentments that accumulated without apparent cause. It was as if something invisible was constantly sowing discord, Carlo observed. Families who loved each other ended up hurting each other with words they didn't want to say. It was disconcerting. In 2005, while visiting a particularly conflictive family despite their Catholic devotion, Carlo noticed a specific plant that grew abundantly in their home. It was a plant he had seen in many homes with similar problems. He felt an inner inspiration, a soft voice telling him, "This is the second one." The Taylor family from the Pacific Northwest lived for years under the influence of this second plant without knowing it. Mark Taylor, now 75 years old, remembers those years with pain. "My wife and I genuinely loved each other, explains Mark. But at home we couldn't be together for more than 10 minutes without arguing. Over anything. The tone of voice, a look, an innocent comment. Everything turned into a fight. Our children grew up in an environment of constant tension. In 2014, a priest who had studied Carlo's life visited the Taylor family as part of his pastoral work. Upon entering the house, he immediately noticed the plant growing in multiple pots around the home. The priest didn't say anything at first, Mark remembers, but after sharing coffee with us and hearing about our marital problems, he gently asked us about those plants. He told us what Carlo Acutis had discovered years earlier in Italy. Mark and his wife were skeptical but desperate. Their marriage was on the brink of collapse. They decided to try. That same afternoon, they removed all the plants of that species from their home. The first days were strangely calm, says Mark, as if something that had been constantly buzzing in the background had finally turned off. My wife described it as being able to breathe for the first time in years. A week after removing the plants, Mark and his wife had a long and deep conversation without it degenerating into a fight. It was almost suspicious, Mark laughs now. We looked at each other as if waiting for the argument to start at any moment, but it didn't happen. We talked for hours about things we had avoided for years because they always ended in shouting. 2 months later, Mark describes the transformation as miraculous. We not only stopped fighting over trivialities, we started to like each other again, to enjoy each other's company. It was as if we had been under a curse that had finally been broken. The second plant that Carlo identified is the cactus, specifically varieties with prominent and aggressive spines. Although many people keep them for their beauty or because they require little care, Carlo discovered that cacti inside homes bring an energy of division and hostility. The spines aren't just physical, Carlo explained to his closest friends. They have a spiritual meaning. They're like small daggers that invisibly wound relationships. Where there are many cacti, there are hurtful words, defensive attitudes, an inability to forgive. This revelation surprised even his most devoted friends. Cacti are so common, so culturally accepted, especially in countries like the United States where they form part of the decor in many homes. How could such an emblematic plant be spiritually problematic? It's not about the plant in its natural habitat, Carlo clarified. In the desert, the cactus fulfills its purpose in God's creation. But when we uproot it from its place and put it inside our homes, we place it in an unnatural context. And in that context, its defensive and thorny nature manifests spiritually in family relationships. Emily Davis, 68, from the Southwest, had collected cacti for 30 years. Her house looked like a desert botanical garden with more than 50 different varieties of cacti placed in every room, hallway, and corner. I loved them, confesses Emily. Each one had a story, a memory. I had brought them from trips. They had been given to me by important people. They were like my children. But Emily's house was also a place of deep loneliness. Her 3 adult children rarely visited her, and when they did, the visits always ended in disagreements and slammed doors. Her husband had passed away years ago, and since then, Emily hadn't managed to form lasting friendships. People would visit me once and not return, she says sadly. I thought it was my personality, that I was the problem. I felt constantly rejected. In 2015, a niece of Emily's who had studied Carlo Acutis' life shared a brochure about his teachings concerning plants in the home. When Emily read about cacti, her first reaction was rejection. I was offended, she admits. How could my precious cacti be responsible for my loneliness? It was ridiculous, but my niece insisted. She begged me to at least try removing them for a month just to see what happened. Finally, more out of love for her niece than out of conviction, Emily agreed. It was a painful process. I cried while removing them, she remembers. I felt like I was abandoning old friends. I placed them all in the backyard under an awning. The transformation in Emily's home was gradual but undeniable. The first thing I noticed, she recounts, was that I myself felt less defensive. Small things that used to offend me didn't bother me as much. It was easier to smile, easier to be kind. 2 weeks after removing the cacti, one of her sons called to invite her to dinner. I almost fell over in surprise, says Emily. It had been more than a year since he had initiated contact with me. During dinner, we talked without tension. It was beautiful. In the months that followed, Emily's relationships with her 3 children improved notably. It wasn't instant magic, she clarifies. There was a lot to heal. But suddenly, healing was possible. Before it seemed there was an invisible wall between us. Now that wall had disappeared. Carlo explained that cacti have a particularly strong effect in 3 areas of family relationships. First, they create an atmosphere of defensiveness where every word is interpreted as an attack. Second, they foster resentment that accumulates silently like the spines that accumulate on the plant. Third, they make forgiveness and reconciliation difficult. I've seen marriages saved simply by removing cacti from the bedroom, Carlo recounted. Not because cacti are demons, but because they eliminate a spiritual obstacle that prevented God's grace from flowing freely in the relationship. William Anderson, 77, from the Midwest, confirms this observation. He and his wife had stopped sleeping in the same room after 20 years of marriage. We didn't hate each other, explains William. We simply couldn't be close without irritating each other. Everything she did bothered me. Everything I said offended her. In the bedroom they used to share, there was a collection of large cacti that William's wife had cultivated for years. When they finally heard about Carlo's warnings, they decided, more out of curiosity than faith, to remove the cacti from the room. The first night was strange, remembers William. The room looked empty without the plants, but it also felt different, lighter somehow. We each slept on our side of the bed without talking much. The second night something changed. My wife turned to me in the darkness, William recounts with an emotional voice, and told me something she hadn't said in years. I miss you. 2 simple words, but they broke something. We hugged and cried together for the first time in, I don't know how long. Today, years later, William and his wife have recovered their intimacy and complicity. We not only started sleeping together again, says William, we became companions, friends, lovers again. The cacti remain in our outdoor garden where they belong, but they will never enter our house again. Carlo was especially emphatic about not having cacti in children's and teenagers' rooms. Young people are forming their capacity to relate, he explained. If they grow up in an environment with this thorny energy, they learn to relate defensively, with hostility, with an inability for tenderness. Nancy Harris, 72, from the Midwest, saw this truth manifest in her teenage grandson. The boy, who lived with her, had become increasingly sullen, aggressive, and inaccessible. We couldn't talk to him without him exploding, says Nancy. It was like walking on eggshells constantly. The teenager's room was decorated with several large cacti that he himself had requested because they looked tough. When Nancy heard about Carlo's teachings, she tried to talk to her grandson about removing the plants. He yelled at me not to touch his things, Nancy remembers, but I prayed for wisdom. One night while he was sleeping, I entered his room and sprinkled holy water on the cacti, praying for his protection. The next morning, something extraordinary happened. The grandson woke up and without any explanation, told Nancy he wanted to give away the cacti. He didn't give me reasons, says Nancy, amazed. He simply said he didn't like them anymore. We removed them that same day. In the weeks that followed, the boy gradually became more accessible. It wasn't an overnight change, clarifies Nancy, but little by little we could start having real conversations. I could hug him without him going stiff. He started smiling again. Carlo also specifically warned about certain types of cacti that are even more problematic. Those with very long spines or particularly aggressive forms, he explained, have more intense effects. And cacti that never bloom, that are pure spine without beauty, are spiritually the most dangerous. If you have cacti inside your home, especially in spaces where the family gathers or in bedrooms, seriously consider Carlo's words. This saintly young man, beatified by the Church, who dedicated his life to love and service, wouldn't share these warnings if he didn't consider them true and important. Right now, I will remove all thorns from my home. In the comments if you're willing to act on this second revelation. But we still need to learn about the third plant that Carlo identified. And this is perhaps the most surprising of all, because it's extremely common, considered beautiful by many, and even associated with religious dates. However, according to the revelations Carlo received, this plant has the potential to be the most dangerous of the 3. During the years 2004-2006, Carlo extensively researched Eucharistic miracles across Europe. In these travels, he noticed something that deeply disturbed him. In many Christian homes, devout and pious, there was a specific plant associated with Christmas and the celebration of Christ's birth. Ironically, this plant that supposedly celebrated life brought with it influences of death. It's the enemy's cunning, Carlo explained with sadness, taking something that celebrates our Savior's birth and turning it into an instrument of spiritual oppression. Most people don't even suspect. The revelation about this third plant came to Carlo during a particularly difficult Christmas in Milan. It was December 2005. There was an epidemic in the city, and many of the sick children he visited were dying faster than usual. Carlo spent entire nights in prayer pleading for his sick friends. One of those nights, while praying before the Blessed Sacrament in his parish chapel, he felt again that extraordinary presence he had felt months earlier. The inner voice, which he recognized as Mary's, spoke clearly to him. "Son, there is a final plant you must know about. It is the most deceptive because it comes disguised as celebration, but where it remains beyond its time, it sows seeds of sadness and illness." In the days that followed, Carlo meditated on these words. What plant could be disguised as celebration? Finally, while walking through the streets of Milan, he saw the answer in a window, a poinsettia, that plant with bright red leaves that adorns homes during Christmas. The Nelson family from New England experienced firsthand the effect of this third plant. Mary Nelson, now 74 years old, tells her story with a trembling voice. "For years I kept poinsettia plants in my house all year round," explains Mary. "I loved their bright colors. After each Christmas, instead of discarding them as most people do, I cared for and maintained them. I came to have 5 large plants that bloomed each year. But in the Nelsons' house, there was a constant shadow of illness. Someone was always sick," remembers Mary. "If it wasn't my husband with some ailment, it was one of the children. Nothing serious, but constant. Colds that turned into bronchitis, unexplained headaches, recurring stomach aches. We lived between doctors and pharmacies." In 2016, a cousin of Mary's who had studied Carlo Acutis' life came to visit. When she entered Mary's house, she immediately noticed the poinsettia plants growing luxuriantly out of season. "My cousin stopped short," says Mary. "She looked at me with concern and asked how long I had kept those plants. When I told her years, she slowly shook her head." The cousin explained what Carlo Acutis had discovered about poinsettias. Although beautiful and associated with Christmas, these plants have a natural toxicity that goes beyond the physical. Their sap is poisonous, and Carlo had observed that spiritually, they also have a weakening effect when kept in homes permanently. Christmas is a time of brief celebration, Carlo had taught. These plants were created for that brevity. When we force their presence beyond their natural time, they become something different. They begin to drain vitality instead of celebrating it. Mary was skeptical but decided to try. "I removed all the poinsettias from my house that very day," she says. "It pained me because I had cared for them for years, but something in Carlo's warning, transmitted by my cousin, deeply disturbed me." The change in the Nelson family's health was gradual but notable. "The first month, my youngest son didn't get sick even once," remembers Mary. "It seemed like coincidence. But the second month passed, the third, the fourth. Suddenly we realized nobody was getting sick. Doctor visits, which had been weekly, became rare. A year after removing the plants, Mary took her whole family for a general medical checkup. The doctors commented that we were all notably healthier than in previous years," she says, "especially my husband, who had chronic anemia. His iron levels had improved without any new treatment." Carlo explained that the poinsettia has a particular quality that makes it spiritually dangerous when kept permanently in homes. "Its beauty is temporary by divine design," he taught. "It blooms in winter to remind us of Christ's birth in the darkness of the year. But it wasn't made to remain. When we force its permanence, we violate its nature, and the consequences are real." Henry Williams, 79, from the Midwest, confirms these observations. For 15 years, he maintained a small greenhouse where he cultivated dozens of poinsettia plants, keeping them alive and flowering all year through special gardening techniques. "It was my pride," confesses Henry. "My neighbors admired my ability to maintain these beautiful plants throughout the year, but I didn't connect these plants with the health problems I began to develop." Henry developed an unexplained chronic fatigue. Doctors did all kinds of studies, he remembers. They couldn't find anything specifically wrong, but I felt constantly exhausted, as if something was slowly draining my energy. In 2018, Henry attended a talk at his parish where Carlo Acutis' teachings about plants in the home were mentioned. When he heard about the Poinsettia, something resonated within him. That night I returned home and looked at my greenhouse with new eyes, he says. Suddenly, I realized I had spent 15 years forcing these plants to live against their nature. What was I really doing? Henry made a difficult decision. He closed his greenhouse and gave away all his Poinsettia plants. It was like saying goodbye to an old friend, he says, but I felt it was the right thing to do. 2 months after closing his greenhouse, Henry noticed his energy beginning to return. It was gradual, he explains. It wasn't dramatic, but every week I felt a little better. 6 months later, I felt like I hadn't in years. I wanted to do things, to live. Carlo specifically warned about keeping poinsettias near sick or elderly people. The weak are more vulnerable, he explained. These plants subtly drain life force. A young and healthy person might not notice it as much, but a sick person, an elderly person, a small child, will feel the effect much more intensely. Ellen Parker, 70, from the East Coast, saw this truth manifest tragically. Her mother, who lived with her and was 90 years old, was in palliative care. Helen, wanting to cheer her mother's room, placed several beautiful poinsettia plants around her bed. I thought the bright colors would cheer her up, Ellen recounts with tears. But in the days that followed, my mother worsened rapidly. Not only physically, but spiritually. She stopped wanting to pray. She said she felt an oppressive heaviness. A nurse who was caring for Ellen's mother and who was devoted to Carlo Acutis noticed the plants. She discreetly suggested to Ellen that she remove them from the room. At first I was offended, admits Ellen. What harm could beautiful flowers do? But the nurse gently insisted, sharing what she knew of Carlo's teachings. Ellen, desperate for anything that might help her mother, finally agreed to remove the plants. The change was almost immediate, remembers Ellen, amazed. That same afternoon my mother asked for her rosary. She said the heaviness had disappeared. She lived 2 more months, and those 2 months were of deep spiritual peace. She was able to say goodbye, to reconcile old grudges, to prepare for her death with dignity. Carlo taught that the poinsettia is not evil in itself. In its appropriate time, during Christmas, it can be a beautiful decoration, he explained, but it should be discarded after the festivities. Keeping it beyond its time is like keeping funeral decorations in the house permanently. It brings an energy that doesn't belong. This teaching has been difficult for many to accept because the poinsettia is so popular and culturally rooted, especially in countries with Christian tradition. But Carlo was firm in his warning. Popularity doesn't make something spiritually safe, he reminded. The wide road is the most traveled, but not always the right one. If you have poinsettia plants in your home outside the Christmas season, or if you keep them year after year, seriously consider Carlo's words. Allow these plants to fulfill their temporary purpose, and then let them go. Your home and your health might improve in ways you don't expect. Right now, I will respect God's timing in the comments if you're willing to remove this third plant from your permanent home. Now that we know the 3 plants that Carlo Acutis identified as spiritually problematic in Christian homes, it's important to understand that the solution is not just to remove them, but also to purify the space they've occupied and protect the home for the future. Carlo taught a specific purification process that should be followed after removing these plants. It's not enough to just remove them, he explained. They've been absorbing and emanating energies for months or years. The space itself needs to be spiritually cleansed. The process Carlo recommended was simple but powerful. First, after removing the plants, physically clean the area where they were. Sweep, mop, dust, he instructed. Physical cleaning prepares the way for spiritual cleaning. Second, sprinkle holy water abundantly in every place where the plants were. Don't be stingy with the holy water, Carlo said with a smile. It's free at church and is one of the most powerful weapons we have. Third, pray in every room that was affected. Carlo specifically recommended the rosary, but also prayers of liberation and protection. Reclaim your home for Christ, he taught. Declare out loud that this is a Christian home under Mary's protection. Grace Stevens, 69, from the Midwest, followed this process meticulously after removing all the problematic plants from her home. "I dedicated an entire Saturday," she recounts. "I cleaned every corner, sprinkled holy water in every room, and prayed the complete rosary while walking throughout the house. The effect was so palpable that even her husband, who had been skeptical of the whole process, noticed it. When he came home that night," remembers Grace, "the first thing he said was, 'What did you do? The house feels completely different.' I hadn't told him about the spiritual cleaning, he simply perceived it." Carlo also recommended placing blessed objects in the places where the problematic plants had been. A sacred image, a crucifix, a picture of the Virgin, he suggested. Replace the negative with the positive. Don't leave the space empty. Charles Reynolds, 71, from the southwest, followed this advice. After removing his pothos, cacti, and poinsettia plants, he placed images of saints in those spaces. "Where I had a large cactus in my bedroom," he recounts, "I placed an image of Saint Joseph. Where I had pothos in the living room, I put a beautiful crucifix. I felt I was reclaiming each space for the Lord." Carlo emphasized that home protection is an ongoing work, not a one-time event. "The enemy doesn't give up easily," he warned. "If we eliminate these plants but don't maintain an active prayer life, he will find other ways to enter." He specifically recommended that families pray together daily, even if briefly. 5 minutes of sincere family prayer, he said, is a stronger wall than any physical lock. He also suggested keeping holy water available in the home and using it regularly. "Sprinkle your home with holy water at least once a week," he advised. "It's like watering a spiritual garden. It keeps the environment pure and receptive to grace." Margaret Foster, 73, from the Northeast, faithfully adopted this practice. "Every Sunday after Mass," she recounts, "I bring fresh holy water. I sprinkle it throughout the house while I pray. It's part of our family routine now. My grandchildren already know. Sunday is Home Purification Day." Carlo also had specific advice about which plants are appropriate and beneficial for Christian homes. "Not all plants are problematic," he clarified. "Some are true blessings." He especially recommended aromatic plants like rosemary, basil, and mint. "These plants have a history of sacred use," he explained. "They have been used in blessings and holy rituals for centuries. They bring purification and protection." He also favored white flowering plants, especially white roses. "White is the color of Mary's purity," he said. "White flowers in the home are like small living prayers." Richard Ortega, 76, from the Pacific Northwest, transformed his garden following these recommendations. After removing all his problematic plants, he replaced them with the ones Carlo recommended. "I planted rosemary, basil, mint," he recounts, "also white roses around my window. The change wasn't just visual. The whole atmosphere of my home changed." Carlo warned against the temptation to simply give away the problematic plants to other people. "If they're harmful to you," he reasoned, "why pass them on to someone else, especially another Christian?" Instead, he recommended disposing of them completely, or, if that felt difficult, placing them outdoors away from windows and doors. "In their natural outdoor habitat," he explained, "these plants have less influence. It's when we bring them into our intimate spaces that they become problematic." Teresa Lopez followed this guidance carefully. "I didn't want to give away my plants and potentially harm someone else," she says. "I placed them in the farthest part of my garden away from the house. There they can exist without affecting my home." A final aspect that Carlo emphasized was the importance of educating others about these truths, but with wisdom and charity. "Don't be fanatical," he warned. "Don't go into others' homes criticizing their plants. But when the appropriate opportunity arises, share what you know with love." He suggested praying for discernment before sharing these teachings. "Not everyone is ready to receive them," he said realistically. "Some people will be offended or mock. Pray to know with whom and when to share." Patricia Ramirez experienced this wisdom practically. "At first excited with my own liberation, I wanted to tell everyone," she admits. "But some people reacted very badly. They called me superstitious, fanatical. I learned to be more discreet, to pray first and only share when I felt a genuine openness." Carlo's teachings about these 3 plants weren't widely published during his lifetime because he himself preferred that they be shared discreetly, from heart to heart. He didn't want to create alarm or fanaticism. He simply wanted to protect families who were open to listening. Spiritual truth, Carlo said, doesn't need spectacular promotion. It spreads quietly like leaven in dough, transforming one family at a time. Today, years after Carlo received these revelations, thousands of families around the world have been blessed by applying his teachings. Testimonies continue to come from people who experienced inexplicable transformations simply by removing these 3 plants from their homes. If you have read this far, it's not a coincidence. Carlo firmly believed in what he called divine coincidences, those moments where God guides us exactly to the information we need at the precise time. If this teaching has reached your hands, he used to say, it's because the Lord wants to purify your home. Don't ignore it. Act with faith and watch how God transforms your space. Right now, I will completely purify my home in the comments if you're committed to following all these teachings from Carlo Acutis. Your public declaration will be the first step toward the complete transformation of your home into a true sanctuary of peace. Carlo Acutis was beatified in 2020, recognized by the Catholic Church as Blessed Carlo Acutis. His teachings, including these revelations about spiritually problematic plants, form part of his legacy of practical wisdom for Christian families. These aren't superstitions or folklore. They are spiritual observations from a young man who dedicated his entire life to God, who was recognized worldwide for his holiness, and who received direct revelations to help families live in greater peace and closeness to Christ. Your home is your primary sanctuary. It's where your children's faith is formed, where marital love is lived, where you pray and rest. Protecting it from negative influences, even those as subtle as certain plants, is an act of love toward your family and of obedience to the guidance God gives us through his saints. Carlo lived until 2006, dedicating his last years not only to documenting Eucharistic miracles, but also to transmitting these protective teachings to families. In his last emails to friends, he reiterated the importance of this wisdom. "Don't neglect these small things," he wrote in an email from 2006. "The enemy works in the small because we know how to defend ourselves from the big. A plant seems so innocent. Who would suspect? But I've seen too many families suffer unnecessarily. If my words can save even one family from that suffering, I will have fulfilled an important purpose." May Blessed Carlo Acutis' teachings about these 3 plants bless your home as they have blessed thousands of families around the world. May your space truly become what it should be, a little heaven on earth where God's presence is felt in every corner. Carlo reminded us that daily prayer opens God's heart. Find the daily prayer guide in the first pinned comment and begin today. Amen.